The sermon title, Spiraling Out of Control. Against the backdrop of that passage. And the link between the two I'll try to get to somewhere in the sermon. It is the fourth Sunday of Advent today, and those of you who paid attention to the lighting of the Advent candle and look at the bulletin cover, you'll notice that the theme is love for this Sunday. Love. Now, one should say or would think that to speak about love is not that difficult. I mean, that's what we think the church should be about. That's what Christianity, religion should be about, to speak about the love of God. And one can probably make that the default position of all sermons, because you can just quote one or two famous theologians, what they said about love. You can bring in a verse or two from the Bible, of which there is plenty that addresses this theme of love. And you can throw in a poem about love as well, of which there is plenty as well, and then the time's up. And you can say, go home and love one another, and the sermon's done. Love has always been, the Christian love, somewhat of a difficult theme for me, because we speak so prolifically and easily about it. And because we say we must love God as we love ourselves, and we must love other people as we love ourselves. So, a famous Christian theologian, St. Augustine, it was one of his main questions always, what does it mean to love God? What do you do when you love God? St. Augustine, those of you who are familiar with the figure, it was around the 5th century, and an interesting figure. He lived a life of enjoying all the carnal pleasures that life could possibly offer. And at some stage after he was partied out, he returned to the Christian faith. And we still endure much of what he thought and what he wrote and try to make sense of it, and some people try to live by it. There were two other famous early Christian theologians to which the phrase was attributed that described the way that the early Christian church and the Christians behaved. And that quote is, "Behold," or "Look, how much they love one another." And it's not only in the days of the internet, but preceding our age of the internet, there are many of these quotes that people assign to somebody famous. When you run into something beautiful about the environment, you can find a lot of that being attributed to Sitting Bull, Chief Sitting Bull. Chief Sitting Bull said this. But when you really start researching the quote, you find out, no. It was some environmentalist probably in the 19th century or the 20th century that said that, but it sounds nice to say Sitting Bull said this thing. And the same with this phrase that said, "Look how much they love one another." It was said that Aristide, a 2nd century Athenian philosopher, at the orders of Emperor Hadrian that built that famous wall through England, that Hadrian sent Aristide to take stock of the Christians because he wanted to continue the policies of the 2 emperors or the 3 emperors preceding him to persecute the Christians. And so legend has it and tradition has it that Aristide went and looked at the Christians and then reported back to the emperor, to Hadrian, saying, look how much they love each other. So no need to persecute them, but that's not the real story. Aristide actually said if there ever was a defense, the best defense that Christians could muster was if they behave in such a way that people would look at them, as he called them, the pagans, the non-Christians, would look at them and say, these are good people, look how much they love one another. So he didn't say to Hadrian, look, these Christians, the beautiful people, the good people, look how much they love each other. He was projecting that and saying, that would be our best defense as Christians. There was another famous theologian, Tertullian, also in the 2nd century, and he was an African bishop. He lived in Carthage, which is Tunis, the capital of Tunisia today. And sometimes this saying, look how much they love one another or each other, is attributed to Tertullian. And he also didn't say, look how much they love one another. Tertullian was constructing, like Aristide, defenses for Christians. He was an apologist for Christianity, defending Christianity. And he also said, the best possible defense for us would be if we could say, if you look at the Christians to determine what they are about and what their nature is, it would be the best if we could behave in such a way to say, look how much they love one another. And if we continue, we can probably find another dozen or so theologians that the saying was attributed to. I don't think it's necessarily a bad offense if it could be true. Some of you who know me perhaps a little bit better will know that I often have to find my way to Christianity and to faith through non-biblical or non-theological writings or thoughts. And I want to invite you to a small snippet of a journey, of my personal journey, while still in South Africa, in that turbulent period that sandwiched the 1994 election in South Africa. A period of extreme violence, of rampant killings, of tribalism and animosity in the worst possible sense, with people killing each other, just with a whiff of the suspicion that they are on the opposing side, and not only between races, but especially among races. It was horrible. And the birthing of a new dispensation was a violent and most often an ugly one. I had the opportunity, if you want to call it that, or I was forced to, more probably so than the rest of society, of the white segment of the population, to experience firsthand how extreme the violence was. Because at that stage I was working as part of the executive team of a startup college for the training of African indigenous church leaders. And I committed myself to that task because I thought in that we could start laying the foundation for this new South Africa. That after people got tired of killing each other and after all the horrible violence probably subsided, that there was something to start to build on. And I tried to make my contribution in a small way by cooperating with some of my ex-professors of the seminary to try and teach these wonderful people, the leaders of the African indigenous churches, the churches that broke away from the Western churches and that were regarded as not very savory and to be avoided by the established churches because there were a lot of indigenous cultural practices that were regarded by some as paganism or devil worship, etc., which was most often nonsense. So we worked with them, and my job entailed negotiating with the church leaders to make them accept the seminary as their training facility, which was tough in any case, because there is a natural distrust when you work across cultural lines. Anybody that's done some anthropological or sociological research know that. So I often found myself in this turbulent period talking to people that I haven't met before, going in at night into townships and areas where people wouldn't dare to go by daytime, and then talking to people about church work and theological training. And sometimes, and I remember one night vividly where I drove 400 miles for a meeting at 9 o'clock at night because these leaders were all working daytime jobs. They were part-time in what they were doing. And as I entered the township, I saw the administrative buildings set alight. They were ablaze. And during our conversation, you could hear people running and you could hear the specific characteristic crackling of automatic gunfire as well. But we were talking peace and we were talking about a beautiful future and training people for the new future that we hope would break through. It was an interesting experience, to call it that. And in that process, as I was also trying to complete my research project for a Master's in Business Administration, which I did on traditional African values and value systems, I read everything that I could find to try and explain what is going on around me. This chaos, this orgy of violence, this extreme tribalism. Why? What is happening? Yes, every system that changes experiences turbulence. But this was extreme to me. And I was deeply embedded in it and deeply invested in it because my ancestry in South Africa goes back to 1688 with the French Huguenots that went there on my mother's side. So I took it to heart to read anything and everything that I could find that could lead me to some explanation of what I was experiencing and observing. And I ran into an American psychologist writing, Clare Graves. I don't know if anybody has heard of the man. Clare Graves, he formulated what was later called spiral technology. He was teaching at the University of Indiana and later at Ohio State as well. Spiral technology in brief, and this is obviously an incomplete and probably very deficient description of his thinking and his theories, spiral technology boils down to an evolutionary view on cultural development, societal development, and the establishing of different value systems associated with different levels and stages of development. At the bottom, and he gave it color codes, he said there's the beige value system, where it is absolutely about individual survival, the very basic stuff, where you focused on yourself and you are trying to make it through life. You are fighting for survival. And then it proceeds through the color codes in a spiral, spiraling upwards to the highest level, which he gave the color code of turquoise. Why turquoise, I don't know. I don't think the colors are significant, that we can say turquoise is a better color than beige. I don't think so. What it was about at the turquoise level was that at that level, it was all about holistic cooperation and a firm grasp of interconnectedness and of selfless sacrifice and selfless service and selfless giving. And at the highest level, that value system, at the top of his spiral, he said that was about people willingly, without being controlled, gave themselves to a renewing existence, making things new. And in the different value systems leading to the turquoise value system, you encounter, for instance, the red value system, I think, which is a very militaristic one, where it was about control through military action, with a very autocratic approach associated with it, and so forth and so forth. I cannot do justice to the theory in a short few minutes in a brief sermon. It may seem long to some of you, and I apologize for that. That to me was a more appetizing and digestible approach than, for instance, Maslow's hierarchy of values. Like Maslow's theory, this was a theory with no evidence-based research backing it up. But Maslow, for me, was so self-centered and self-focused about our needs and how to satisfy our needs from the lowest level, which was also about needs on a survival level, to the highest, where it deals with self-fulfillment. I grabbed onto Clare Graves and his spiral technology as a way that also created hope for me. And I wanted to believe that the spiral technology is indeed true, that there is an evolutionary and improving evolutionary tendency embedded, or at least the possibility of it, in society and in humanity. From the same era in my life comes that passage that we listened to from the book of Ephesians. And I was asked to officiate at the wedding ceremony of two very dear friends of mine. And while struggling with what was happening in society, and also facing the questions from them whether they should remain when married in South Africa, where it seems that everything was being torn apart, I came across this passage in Ephesians that Paul wrote to his beloved church in Ephesians, the first one that he founded. And he speaks about the dimensions of God's love. How deep and wide and high, etc., more dimensions than we normally deal with and live by. And this passage from Ephesians affirmed for me the possibility that I encountered in that Graves technology. That there is hope that we can aspire to. That if we let go of our natural tendency to control, and if we are able, as Paul writes, through God's Spirit in us, to let go of the tendency to make it all about ourselves, whether it is on an individual level or on a tribal level, on a group level, then those two axes in the spiral technology of letting go of the tendency to control and being removed as the center of your universe and being recreated and renewed as somebody that lives with a self-sacrificing approach towards life and a giving approach of service, then maybe we can encounter and experience something of the love that Paul speaks about. And I think that Jesus also spoke about. So as we approach Christmas, as we look towards the new year, especially in a world that seems turbulent, unsettled, sometimes out of control, let us remember the words of Paul about the multidimensional wonder of God's love. Let us open ourselves to God's Spirit. Let us, as the beloved community, continue on our path to grow in faith. And may we increasingly be able, in openness to God's Spirit, to spiral out of control, to be removed from the tendency to control and to grow upwards towards a place of hope while we live and we embrace God's love in us. Let us, as God's people, spiral out of control. Amen.